Welcome to AFWA Canada's fourth live webinar in the series, The Evolving Indigenous Workplace, Defining a New Normal, where we are sharing resources and information that can help you navigate through the ever-changing events around COVID-19. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can add them in the Q&A window. So far what we've done is we've looked a lot at the financial sort of impact, I guess, with some of the support programs that were available. So First Nation Bank has done that. We looked at how you might be able to account for some of these programs. So MNP did a presentation on that. We shifted gears here, and now we're kind of focusing on the human resources aspect. So last week we talked about returning to the workplace, and we're going to pick up on that again this week here. But also, there's been a lot of lessons learned as we've been kind of going through this. So we want to talk about that and how that might be helpful to what might occur in the fall. So, at the end, there will be about a 15 to 20-minute Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So certainly, you provide your questions at any time through the Q&A box, but certainly at that time you can do it as well. And there will be polling questions throughout the webinar. So please submit your answers when we do submit the polls, because they're kind of real-time sort of answers to the questions, and we can all benefit from that. So today our presentation is Returning to the Workplace, Ask the Experts, and our presenter from Borealla Management is Tanya Neitzert. So today we have three people that are going to present. There's Tanya, we have Lindsay Evedin, and Lila Bussier. So Borealla Management are a human resources consultancy and with a specialization in supporting Indigenous organizations to build capacity through their people. Both Tanya and Lindsay are partners in Borealla Management. Tanya has an extensive background as an HR practitioner, and Lindsay's background is in business strategy and leadership development. They are joined by their team member Lila, whose background is in the area of organizational development. Each of them have been actively supporting their clients in relation to managing their responses to the COVID-19 situation and helping them plan suitable HR strategies for now and the future. Building on from the session we had last week, covering health and safety considerations, today Tanya and her colleagues will answer questions that you may have when thinking through the return to the workplace of your employees. But before we jump into your question, Tanya will share with us some additional areas that you may want to consider as you reflect on the lessons your organization has learned from your response to the pandemic, and give you some ideas on how your organization can prepare for the future and the potential of a second wave. I certainly want to thank Borealla for stepping up and doing these two sessions. So I'll turn it over to you, Tanya. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Terry. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. And welcome on behalf of Lindsay and Lila as well. I don't know if you wanted to say a quick hello.
Hi.
Hi, Lila and Lindsay. There will be behind the scenes, but they'll be joining me, and I'll explain a little bit about the Q&A in a minute. So just about our webinar today, as restrictions are gradually lifting across Canada and employees are returning to work, many employers are asking themselves questions about how they'll bring employees back and what the new normal will look like. And as Terry mentioned, asking questions about how to plan for the future. So today we're going to touch on some questions that came up during last week's webinar and that you've continued to provide to us between these weeks. And we're going to let you have some opportunity to ask these questions at the end as well. So quickly about Borealla. So Borealla, as Terry mentioned, is a human resources consultancy firm headquartered in Montreal. We support clients across Canada in 6 main areas. One of the areas that we do support clients in is in human resources fundamentals. And so we do have an expertise in health and safety, as well as in workforce planning and crisis management. Therefore, AFOA has generously asked us today to participate in this webinar, and we're really, really pleased to be here. So we do work with clients, as Terry mentioned, from all industries, but we do have extensive experience working with Indigenous governments and organizations, including band councils, school commissions, health boards, and private sector companies. And as mentioned, our ultimate goal is to build capacity through people. So what we'll cover today is actually grouped in three main areas. So first, we want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we've heard, but how to learn from it and how to think about the future. So that'll be in the first section. The second section, we'll actually address the questions that were submitted by a lot of you. So we did get a ton of questions. Thanks so much for those. And we're going to address as many of them as we can and go through those today. Behind the scenes, Lila and Lindsay are going to be actually answering your questions as you go along, or we'll bring them forward at the Q&A at the end. So do please go ahead and send as many questions as you have. We're going to try to get to all of them if we can. Lindsay and Lila will answer some of them during today's presentation, or like I said, there will be an open Q&A at the end where we'll answer some of the questions that you bring up during the webinar, and Lindsay and Lila will bring some of those questions you asked throughout at the end. So let's actually start with a poll. So did your organization have any kind of emergency plan? So we do want to begin, and just while you're answering the poll, we want to begin today's webinar with a discussion about the challenges we've been hearing since the pandemic began. So one of those challenges is about the planning that you've had. So no doubt this has been, from our clients, we've heard so much from clients that, you know, having a plan in place wasn't readily available. So we can certainly appreciate that has been a challenge for you as well. So whether that's an emergency measures plan or a business continuity plan, some of you even have as much as a pandemic plan in place, others don't. So do we have a status of the poll? Well, look at you. So not bad. We have 67% of you did have some kind of a plan and 33% didn't. So we will look at how we can consider implementing such plans or putting a plan in place as a result of the poll. But I'm curious actually about the next poll. So why don't we put up the next poll? So do you feel like your organization reacted effectively to the pandemic? So another challenge we've heard is the response to the pandemic. So even with an emergency plan, many employers found it difficult to react. This was an unprecedented situation, and not all emergency plans could cover all of those areas that needed to be considered. Thinking about transitioning your employees virtually, thinking about transitioning your employees, maybe laying off some employees or closing your operations. These were all really big challenges that we've heard from many of you. So we could appreciate that the reaction, even with a plan, maybe was difficult. How is that poll coming along? Did everyone answer? Wow, that's impressive. 93% of you felt like you did reacted effectively to the pandemic. So that is great news. And so that is something we'll continue to discuss today. So how we can take that, the reaction time and put it into maybe more solid planning for a potential future wave. But that is really great. So some other challenges that we've heard, so I mentioned already the lack of a plan and the response time, but some other challenges that we've heard, and maybe some of you can relate to this, was managing the workforce. So how to figure out who is an essential service, whether or not to pay employees who are unable to work, whether to lay off, and those matters. So these were challenges that we've heard. Many of our employees felt like they were constantly in reaction mode, and even still today, that it's constant thinking, replanning, remapping, new public health guidelines. And so whether or not it was effective, it's still been a big challenge. Lack of policies. So we've heard from some of our clients that policies had to be adapted on the fly, given that policies didn't always incorporate certain situations that you were facing. And finally, just those new health and safety considerations that need to be implemented. This has been a huge headache for everyone. Of course, you're doing it because you want to take care of your employees and you want to ensure that your employees are well looked after and that you provide a safe environment, but those are really challenging to put in place. So as we know, there may be a second wave. We certainly hope that there isn't, but the new reality may be with us for a while, whether or not there is a second wave. And some of the lessons that we might have learned could, or some of the changes that were made might benefit us moving forward. We might want to implement some of these changes more permanently. So we really recommend that you take this opportunity to learn from the past. This is a way your organization can develop on the whole. And you can just ensure that you're implementing or being ready for any potential future situation that might arise. So how do you go about learning from the past? Well, the first step that we would really recommend, or the action that we recommend, is a postmortem or a lessons learned activity. So this is where you would take the time to look at how the response to this situation was handled. So you would look at such questions like, what worked well? So certainly many of you are saying that the response generally was effective. So why was it? Was it because your management team was really responsive? Was it because you did have a lot of those policies in place, and so on? What needed improvement? So what did you have to figure out along the way? Was it communications? Was it how to deal with technology? So these are some important questions to ask. And what was the most challenging? Was it the engagement of your employees, perhaps? So these are some questions that you'll want to ask yourselves. It's really important to document these processes and what was implemented, as well as what was successful and what needed modifying. So you have a record of what happened, but you also can use that information to plan for the future. You want to look at maybe some key areas in this assessment. So as you go through those questions we mentioned, this documentation process should be really focusing in the current situation of the pandemic, of your health and safety policies, the workforce planning, so identifying those essential services and how you manage the workforce, looking at the organization of the workspace, and the cleaning and hygiene measures that you implemented. The lessons learned process should include many stakeholders. So consider not only the stakeholders who are in a decision-making role, like your management team, but consider also those who are impacted by all of these changes or this situation generally. So your employees, the union, your health and safety committee, anyone who really had an impact. And it can be good or really recommended to do these learning sessions over a few periods. So not just a single 1-hour meeting, but rather maybe a few sort of half-day sessions so that you can really spend time learning and identifying what might be needed moving forward. So at this point, we would like to do another poll. So there we go. So as it stands today, how prepared do you think your organization is for a potential second wave? And so while you consider that, I'll just begin the next slide here, which is about planning for the future. So now that we've had this experience of going through a really difficult and challenging situation, we do have the opportunity to look towards the future and identify how we can improve. Whether many of you feel like you did do great, or whether you're feeling like, it will be a challenge. Even if you were planned and organized, it's still difficult. It was still very difficult for everyone. So we certainly hope a second wave doesn't hit, but having a plan for emergency situation will be really helpful. So let's see if we have the poll results there to see how you are all feeling. So we'll be ready. So after everything we've heard in recent months, we'll be ready. So that 70% of you feel like you'll be ready, especially given everything you've heard. Some of you feel like there's a fair bit of work to do, and none of you, and that is such great news, feel not at all prepared. So those are good results. So as we plan for the future, some of the things that you'll want to consider would be whether you have a plan in place. And again, we won't spend too much time talking about that since so many people do seem to have a good plan, but nevertheless, always important to consider, and whether you need additional plans like a pandemic plan. Assessing the gaps and developing an action plan to minimize these gaps. So ready, we hope you are. It sounds like many of you feel ready, but there is still a great opportunity to assess what gaps were in place and to minimize them. To plan your workforce accordingly. So consider, for example, succession planning. If you have essential services, you may wish to consider who might be able to replace employees who may get sick. So having a succession plan in place will be important, or just to consider who are your essential services employees and how to manage if you do have to have another shutdown. you may wish to update some of your policies. So this can be an opportunity either to put in place, maybe a more robust work from home policy now that we've had this experience where many people are working from home, or you may feel like you need to actually update some policies like your temporary layoff policy to ensure that you can be more agile if a second wave comes. Ensuring that you have the tools and technologies. So we've heard from our clients, not everybody has access to laptops. So giving access maybe to more laptops if funding is an opportunity for you, or just to ensure that everybody is trained on those technology, so make sure that everybody knows how to use Zoom appropriately or Teams or whichever tools you're using. And finally, if anybody was at last week's webinar, you can probably remember us talking about the importance of a communications plan. So it's always a great opportunity to have a communications plan for any potential situation and to really consider your employees in communications overall now as people are coming back to work and as we have any potential future situation. So now that we've looked at that first section on taking stock of where we were and planning for the future, we'd now like to turn to the questions that you brought forward. So what I'll do is I'll just begin to list off the questions that you've all sent in, and I'll be sharing the answers with you. And so as mentioned, please keep them coming. We're here for this today, Ask the Expert. So we're looking forward to just answering the questions that you had. So the first question is, an employee tested positive for COVID-19, and what do I do? Can I enforce a mandatory quarantine? So actually, you really must enforce the mandatory quarantine if someone has tested positively. Your obligation as an employer is to have a safe and healthy, or a safe workplace, which is free from hazards. So hazard would be if somebody comes in contact with someone with COVID-19. So it is actually essential for you to ensure that that person is on a 14-day quarantine. Okay, so the second question is, can an employer request the details of an employee's health? This is a pretty interesting question. So because many of the answers, are, it depends. But so if we're specifically talking about COVID-19, you can absolutely, and in fact, you must ask the question. So in the health questionnaire that you should be asking your employees on a daily basis at work, where the three questions, do they have the symptoms of COVID-19? Have they been around someone with COVID-19, or have they traveled? These are essential for you to ask, and so mandatory at this moment in time. If the question is relating more to, are you able to ask if someone has any health symptoms or health conditions, such as diabetes, for example, this is where more caution should be exercised, because the medical confidentiality relates more to the need to know basis. So you can certainly ask an employee if they have any conditions that might prevent them to work. And depending on how you treat that information, who is using that information, and why that information is being requested, is where the judgment call needs to come in. So it will depend on your industry type and the type of work that you're doing with your employees. What is the guideline around travel and enforcing quarantine of an employee who has traveled to another province or an area that is a hot spot for the virus? So this is a great question that came up last week as well, and we did have a fun back and forth on the chat. And again, this one is a challenge because this is changing every day, and it does depend entirely on where people are traveling from and to. So different jurisdictions or different geographical areas have their own rules and regulations. So the best practice is, first of all, to restrict non-essential travel for everyone. That's not just employers. But if an employee does travel to a hotspot, and depending on the public health guidelines, you may wish to enforce a self-isolation. So again, this will really be dependent on the area specifically. And we're talking in Canada. If they've traveled outside of Canada, they will be required to self-isolate. But it will, even in the Maritimes, there's some current discussion about having that they can expand to the Maritimes generally for travel. So it will depend on these jurisdictions or these borders within Canada. how can we ensure that bathrooms are clean and sanitized between use? Again, this came up last week and we thought it would be good to raise again in our Q&A. So bathrooms are important, and it will depend a lot on whether or not, how many people will use the bathrooms, if they're shared amongst different employers or one employer. A best practice is firstly to ensure that there is a very solid cleaning procedure that is increased during this time. So perhaps if there's a cleaning service or a building, validate that it could be cleaned 2 to 3 times a day instead of once a day. But in addition, as we mentioned last week, it could be a great, just a proactive practice to put some cleaning supplies in the bathroom and request that employees clean it before entry and after exit. You know, again, consider as well those door handles and such. So the more you can consider how to best protect employees, the better you will be at ensuring that you're providing a safe environment. So what are the measures that employees can take to ensure that their employer is taking the necessary health and safety precautions? This is an excellent question because employees absolutely have the right to know. So health and safety is your obligation as an employer, and your employee has a right to know what measures you have taken to ensure that you are protecting their safety. COVID-19 is an exceptional situation that really requires a lot of careful consideration on your part. So you must absolutely share this information with them. We mentioned on the webinar last week some steps you can take, which would include, or some steps you must take actually, which would include training your employees. Perhaps we recommended to train your employees virtually before their return to work, or if people are already working, to ensure that they have access to that policy, that they have a training, and that they really understand those procedures. And so if the employer is not following these, there's multiple actions an employee can take. They can certainly refuse to work, and they can make a claim of they can exercise their right to refuse to work. And there are some significant steps you have to take in that case, or a report could be called in to the authorities. And so there are some consequences. So again, for your employees, they have a right to know, and as employers, you would have the opportunity, or you must, you know, you have some consequences if they're not being adhered to. So the next section, we'll look at some HR related questions. So this was another really great question that came up last week and that also was sent forward following. So again, I'd love to thank you for these really important and great questions. So do you have any ideas of how to manage the resentment amongst staff when employees are no longer being treated fairly and equitably? This one is a bit close to my heart because in HR and in managing of employees generally, the notion of equity does not mean that everyone has to be treated exactly the same. And so think about this from a perspective of pay. So even though you do not pay everybody the same, there are reasons for that, and there is a structure at place to make sure that there is still equity. So these notions should be kind of considered differently. And what we recommend is to start off by thinking about what is your global perspective, or what is your position, what is your value when it comes to employee treatment. So if your value for employee treatment is that we want to ensure that everybody has a job during this pandemic and we have the financial capacity to pay all of our employees, even those who aren't working, and that is a business decision that you're making. And so how are you going to implement that policy in a way that is equitable? So this might mean that you'll pay, for example, a premium to the employees who are essential services. However, perhaps your employer perspective is that we value and appreciate all of our employees, but we believe that only those employees who you know, are working are going to be paid during this period. And so then you can lay some employees off. All of these decisions will imply or make some employees feel unjust, because some employees will be laid off, some employees will be working from home, and some employees are conducting essential services for which they will be paid. You can consider premiums, as I mentioned, or other recognition, and you can consider moving people around or supporting other groups. But ultimately, the question of equity comes down to the framework that you have and how you can communicate that in a way that's transparent. So it is a big challenge, and we can appreciate that. And I wish there was a magic wand I could wave to say, you know, we'll just pay these people or do this thing. But ultimately, the most fair thing you can do is make sure that the system as a whole is fair. I spent a lot of time on that one, but like I said, it's close to my heart. So if an employee if an employer keeps an employee without COVID-19 symptoms out of work, is there a requirement to compensate the employee? And this question I assume that this question is referring to if the employer has to close, like for COVID-19, if you're a non-essential organization. So this will really depend on the circumstances, and mostly it depends on the jurisdiction, the nature of the closure, the compensation practices or the policies that you already have in place. You may have a policy, even if that policy you'd like to change it over time, and maybe you will, but if you have a policy in place already, or if you have a collective agreement and such. So those are all of the questions that you need to validate first. If there's any, depending on the context, what does the local legislation say? But in general, if an employee is not working, you don't have to pay them. But again, I do want to just qualify that by saying there can be a lot of circumstances to consider. But no, again, broadly speaking, for the most part, you shouldn't have to pay an employee if they're not conducting work. So if an employee actually has COVID-19 and can't work, here again is a challenging situation because someone with COVID-19 is obviously, they must stay home. You need to ensure that they're not in the workplace, and that's your obligation. Whether or not you pay them, and again, with the previous question as well, whether or not you pay them comes up with circumstances, but also some employer choice. So if somebody does have COVID-19, again, it will depend on the duration, the severity, but you'll want to have a policy that is global and encompasses those situations. I don't want to make it seem like your result would be ad hoc. But consider short-term disability is going to be a great option for a longer-term case. And again, is there sick time available to somebody? In general, as I've mentioned before, you don't have to pay an employee, but there are many considerations, including whether the employee contracted COVID-19 at the workplace. Can an employer fire an employee if they have COVID-19? And the answer here is absolutely not. So an employer may not terminate an employee or otherwise discriminate against an employee due to a physical disability. This is human rights legislation. And so this is, at this point, the laws are continuing to evolve, or the jurisprudence is continuing to evolve, but in some jurisdictions it is has been identified to include COVID-19. So what if an employee refuses to work because they're afraid of contracting COVID-19 in the workplace? So there are a couple of answers here, and this is an excellent question also. So if an employee, first of all, the employee has the right to refuse work if they have a genuine belief that there's a hazard at the workplace. And in COVID-19, this can be quite broad at this moment. So I think we would recommend that in general, if a good faith a question is brought up, you certainly have to go through the proper procedures under the right of refusal to work. So assuming that the employee takes the appropriate action, brings it forward appropriately, then you would have to let them stay home, and also they would have to be paid for that duration. So there is a process that you have to follow under the right of refusal to work. However, it's the question of whether this was, if the employee is bringing it to you not so much because they're afraid of a hazard at work, but because they're afraid of perhaps, taking public transit, or they just have a general anxiety, which we have seen is quite common right now, about being in public. That is a different situation. So there are certain factors in general. So just to speak generally, employees can refuse to work if they have a fair complaint or concern about the health and safety of the workplace itself. But otherwise, employees are required to present themselves to work. Can employees be disciplined for a work refusal? So let's just assume that this employee now has exercised their right to refusal to work and has gone through the process, but it turns out that that complaint was made in bad faith. So yes, in that situation, they could be disciplined. I think the caution that we would bring here is that this is an evolving situation where employees are under real difficult situation, a lot of mental health concerns right now. So perhaps your thinking could be fairly broad in this circumstance. Certainly if somebody is using COVID-19 as an excuse because they want to play golf for the summer and they're happy to be out in public, and they're happy to, and they made a complaint claiming that the workplace wasn't safe, then yes, they could be disciplined. But again, we just recommend that you really exercise some caution before taking that stance to ensure that you've really thought through the process and that you've gone through all the appropriate steps with the authorities. Additional HR questions. There were many. So what if I need to replace sick employees on a temporary basis to operate? So let's say, for example, that we can assume, I think here, that what we're talking about is that employees may be sick due to COVID and you'll have to replace them. So certainly you can hire temporary employees, but you can also potentially ask, sorry, I should have the question up there. Potentially you can ask some currently employed, like other employees, to replace those positions, or to work a little overtime, obviously depending on, your collective agreements and your policies and so on, and ensure that you pay overtime as required. But you obviously have a lot of options. So again, one of the questions you'll have to ask yourself is, do you need to replace them in the first place? If they're essential services and you do, then you may want to shuffle people around, or you could consider hiring temporary employees. Do I need to require a medical note for COVID-19 positive cases? So here, many jurisdictions have been pretty clear that it is not an obligation of the employer to request a medical note. In fact, requesting a medical note is a burden to the medical system. And so in general, it is not required for you to ask for a note allowing someone to come back after they've had COVID-19. So that is the best practice right now. There is always the question about whether, as an employer, you would prefer to have a medical note. But again, given the fact that most employers or most jurisdictions are firmly stating that is not required, you would be best to simply follow the public health guidelines on that. With employees working from home, there is an imbalance in workload. So this is similar to the other question that we mentioned before. So maybe some are overworked, others maybe don't have enough work. This can certainly be the case. So what do we do? So one of the best things to do here is to really be in contact with your employees, to make sure that you understand where your employees are. So we had recommended last week to do pulse checks and check-ins with your employees, just to make sure you have a good sense of the status of your employees. If one person is feeling overworked, definitely find some support for the others. If people are underworked, they have some options. Again, there's the option of potentially laying them off or having them go on vacation, depending, again, I'm always qualifying this based on jurisdiction, policy, etc. But there are many options there, but you can also consider work sharing. You can consider redistribution of work, or you can consider like a temporary work transfer, again, depending on your policies and how that's been structured in the first place, if they're unionized and so on. If an employee contracts COVID-19 at work, are they covered under workers' compensation? So this is an interesting one because it is something that is evolving. Some answers would be that it depends. I mentioned that a couple of times already, but it will depend really on the workers' compensation boards are saying right now that in some cases, yes, but it will really be important to validate, or for the workers' compensation board to validate that the employee absolutely got COVID-19 as a result of the workplace. So, that is something that will be interesting to watch unfold. What's recommended right now is that if an employee does make a claim, that you do go through the process, submit the paperwork as you're required to, and it will just be a situation that does evolve over time. How do we monitor our employees working remotely? And so again, here, this depends on a few factors. So if the concern, like in terms of answering the question, if the concern is really that employees, are they putting in their time? The best way to monitor this would be to start off with a really well-defined policy. So what are your expectations? So a policy and your expectation settings. For example, you might say, we expect our employees to be present at a 9 a.m. meeting every day so that we can look at, what is the day unfolding. So that would be a good example. Or we expect people to answer their emails between 9 and 5 within an appropriate time frame, but we're not expecting them to answer emails after 5. For example, I'm saying, a variety of things that can happen. It's preferred, this is a tough situation for everyone, and we always take the position that it is preferred to treat employees with some trust, and trust goes two ways, so to monitor too closely or to request that they're online every second of the day can be tough when you're working from home, but at the same time there can be ways that you can set expectations, and you can come back if there's consequences by monitoring their workload, monitoring the submission of their work, the completion of the tasks that you assign. Finally, can an employer take a temperature to determine whether they might be infected? And what about other medical testing? So this is, again, a great question. And the answer, again, is it depends. So there is nothing stopping you from taking you can take the temperature, but again, it's recommended that you really consider the industry first. So there are some industries where it may be appropriate in healthcare, for instance, and some where it's less so. So depending on the nature of the business, in addition, the taking of temperatures is not considered to be a fundamental, like a response, a certainty, to give a certainty to a positive case. It's not always the best approach. It could be better to ask those three health questions that we've mentioned a few times. So have you traveled? Do you have symptoms? And have you been around anyone with COVID-19? If you do choose, or if based on like the industry standards and so on, you do move forward, you also have to be quite careful in how you go about that. There should be a professional who's has the appropriate skills to take temperature, and you should record it appropriately. So personal protection equipment questions. So do employers have to buy personal protective equipment for employees? So it depends. It depends on whether you're going to be asking your employees to be within the 2 meters, or if there's other reasons why personal protective equipment might be appropriate. So you'll have to do your workplace assessment and validate how you're setting up your office and the reason behind that, or your workspace, I should say. And it would be then that you would identify whether there is a requirement. So your requirement is to provide a safe environment, and so you will have to do you have the obligation of validating what that work environment looks like and how to make it safe. So if after that assessment you identify that you need to put in place personal protective equipment, then yes, you should certainly purchase it for your employees. What happens when employees cannot provide PPE to all employees? So under the situation of shortages and so on. And so here, again, it is imperative that your obligation is to provide the best services your obligation to follow the health and safety guidelines and your occupational health and safety obligations. And so the first thing, the most important thing would be to validate if those employees are essential to your business operation. So for instance, if you're unable to, if you need to have personal protective equipment in place, and then if you are unable to procure it, then you would have to identify if you would have to perhaps send employees home, or if you would have to adjust the workplace to make it more safe, or what procedures you would have to put in place while you wait for that backlog to come back. It is very industry specific. So you've seen the news about, healthcare, those employees must be on the floor, they have to be there, and they've been finding other ways, creative ways to create their own masks and so on, or cleaning procedures and so on. But the best practice, of course, would be if you are looking at these return to work now, and you're going to need to have personal protective equipment, to be sourcing it, and to ensure that you look at really, long-term suppliers that you can be careful with over time, just to make sure that you're prepared. If personal protective equipment is being used, does the 2 meter distancing rule apply? So certainly you need to ensure to the best possible measure that you can enforce the distancing. So it depends a little bit on certain factors, like if it is an absolute requirement of the business that nothing can be adjusted, then the personal protective equipment can help. But you still are under the obligation to the best of your capacity ensure that the 2 meter distance can apply. And so unless you're in some very essential service, it's really recommended that you take good care to enforce the physical distancing. And whether or not, and it's not a question of the personal protective equipment shouldn't prevent that. You can't just put masks on people and expect that they can just sit a foot apart. So can an employer prevent an employee from wearing masks at work? So this question will depend on whether, so I think this question is referring to whether an employee would like to choose to wear a mask at work. And so certainly we would generally believe that your employees should have the possibility of wearing a mask at work. Again, this one is something that is a bit subject to some discussion on in various jurisdictions and in various sources. So we would recommend that you continue to take a look at the local public health guidelines and the local discussions. However, if you do have, for example, a vulnerable population who would like to wear a mask, certainly the employer, we just wouldn't want to recommend that an employer prevents their employees. Now, do they have the right to prevent? Again, it would likely depend on the circumstances surrounding it, if they can. So can an employer demand that an employees wear a face mask at work? And again, this is an interesting one because perhaps it isn't a question of employees being too close to one another, but perhaps the employer just wants to take extra care and caution and wants to insist that everybody wears a face mask at work. So employers should probably, in doing so, should probably consider doing a hazard, assessment of the workplace first, an assessment of their employees. Just really do a solid assessment of, engineering controls, administrative controls. If you identify that you'd like to put something in place, you will need to have a very solid procedure about how that's going to look. So is it every moment? Is it only in certain places? How do employees put it on and put it off? That's the case under any circumstance. But again, if you would like to implement a mask wearing policy now, do bear in mind that that is not currently the local public health guideline. And so again, we always recommend that your first instinct be to validate what is being commonly recommended by the local public health guidelines, as that does vary quite frequently, but also is jurisdictional based. So at this point, we've answered the questions that many of you have asked throughout the past weeks, and yet I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask Lindsay and Lila to jump back in. There's Lindsay. And let us know. So how did the Q&A go, guys?
Yeah, we had a very active Q&A. So a lot of the questions we were actually able to answer. We had a couple of people that we suggested to give us their contact details because we got thrown a couple of tricky ones that I know we'll need to look into. But there's a couple here that I know, Tanya, you could give some great insights on. So the first one is, can you speak to dealing with annual leave where vacation entitlements may go unused due to COVID? And I think that this is right now is a very valid question. Absolutely.
So actually our organization is looking at that same question, but so in general, you are obliged to allow your employee to take their leave. And so if you have to carry vacation over, you will have to carry vacation over, but really your obligation is to allow your employees to take leave. So the challenge, I suppose, will be in a few circumstances. So one might be if it's because they're laid off at this moment and they just can't get to their vacation until, they come back to work. And so in that case, you have to roll it over or pay it out. But there are some really careful considerations to make because as an employer, you don't always have the right to roll over vacation. You may have to allow your employees to take it at a certain period. So again, I hate to always bring it back to the jurisdiction and the circumstance, but it does really depend on the circumstance. So if, for instance, all your employees are coming back to work in December, there may be some good reason how you could roll it over instead of, allowing the employees to come back in December and then having to put them on vacation immediately after. But in general, if I can sort of say a final comment is we do really recommend that you allow, if you can't, that you give the opportunity for employees to take vacation because it's a time when employees really need to take vacation. It's been a tough period, I think, for everyone.
Mm-hmm. So kind of along the same lines, but around time out of work, we were asked the question, are organizations granting additional sick time to ensure staff take it and use it should they get COVID?
This is a great question. So I think I've seen a fair bit of discussion about extending sick leave policies. And what I've been seeing is that one of the considerations, it can be a good idea. Many employers are considering to enhance their sick leave policy, but to consider doing it just for COVID. I mean, obviously you'll include sick leave policies for all sorts of circumstances, but you might have a special sick leave policy for COVID, so that if your employees do need to take time off for COVID-related symptoms, that they're able to do so, and that this be a temporary policy that you could put in place until such a time as things are, less required. Mm-hmm. Some employers may consider modifying it over time because, again, the new normal may be changing, and we may see a stronger requirement to stay home when people have cold-like symptoms.
Yeah, and actually we've got another question along those lines. Can we make it a policy that an employee has to inform us if they're being tested for COVID? So that's the first part of the question. I don't know whether, I'm just going to throw the question at you. It's in several parts, sure. Okay? Sure. Can we make it a policy that an employee has to inform us if they're tested for COVID? Can we request those calling in sick to get tested? So can an organization force their employees to get tested? And can we make it a policy that they inform us if they get a positive result? Mm-hmm.
So those are really great questions, and maybe Lila can pop in as well, just to sort of help me out in case, depending on if there's any additional points you'd like to make. But certainly, because you would be asking your employees every day about their current health status, it likely seems to me like it would not be needed to ask the employer if they're being tested, but certainly because you're asking if they did test positively or if they have symptoms, then in fact they would be giving the answer. So it seems to me like, yes, you could ask the question as part of your health questionnaire, but it's the reason those questions have been designed in the way that they are should naturally bring about those answers. It's a bit weak there, but I don't know if you are absolutely authorized to ask the question, but it seems to me like in this circumstance, you would be well advised to ask those other three questions, but you could ask that specific question, are you currently undergoing testing? I think that would make sense under this current circumstance.
Yeah.
And what was the other part? I missed a part of the question there.
So can they make it a policy that they inform them that if they get a positive result?
Yeah.
Yes, they can.
Yeah. So absolutely, they have to, if they either have COVID or if they've tested, or if anyone around them has COVID, they must inform.
They're obliged to inform their employer, we have a question here on the business continuity plan. So somebody wants to know, have other organizations written additional sections to their plans around COVID, or left it as is as part of the general emergency that could arise? So I can actually take that one. Yes, we have seen organizations that have written business continuity plans, not just added sections, but written specific business continuity plans for COVID. Other organizations have it as part of some organizations have it as part of their pandemic planning, so it was very easy to adapt. Other organizations had their emergency measures plan that didn't really have the specifics, the business continuity specifics for COVID. So yes, we have seen organizations adapting those plans specifically for the situation we're dealing with now. Now let's see, I think, okay, I have one other question here that had come up, Tanya, but we didn't put it in the slides, around fines. So the kinds of fines that employers or employees, or I guess the repercussions for employees, should they not be adhering to the rules?
Yeah, so there are definitely fines. Each jurisdiction will have its own fines, and the fines will vary depending on the nature of the infraction. So from the employer perspective, again, really be careful of this, because it's a reputational damage issue, but it's also fines. They can be quite costly, but it does depend. It's not a flat fee. It'll depend on certain circumstances, and again, it's jurisdictional based. On the employee side, it's a lot more rare that there would be a financial sanction taken against an employee in a circumstance. It would be more likely that they would receive some kind of discipline or some kind of other measure. But again, those fines, they do exist depending on the jurisdiction, the actual amounts.
Okay. So Terry, we have one more question here. I don't know if we have time to cover it.
Yeah, let's cover it and then we'll transition.
Okay, perfect. So this actually came through the chat. If during the daily health survey an employee reports having some symptoms, is the employer response to request a 14-day isolation unless a negative test can be provided? So yeah, if they identified, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So if an employee exhibits symptoms in the middle of the day, your first obligation is to confine them, so to isolate them. And then, yes, you would send them home and require a 14-day isolation unless they would be able to let you know that they've had a negative response or negative test. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Geez, those are really good questions. Last week and this week, this is really, really important information as we kind of transition back to the workplace. And as we were going through these questions, I was reflecting on some of the questions that have come up over the last 2 weeks. And really the foundation of all of this is trust. And I guess the question I have to you guys is, what's your, do you have any strategies for organizations to use that helps us build trust amongst them, with it, not only our staff, but our staff with us? Like, what should we be doing to really ensure that trust is and I don't like to use the word building, because trust isn't a notion of building. It's you demonstrating trust yourself as how you bring forward trust in an organization. So you have to show that you're doing activities that build trust as well. So, what's your take on that in terms of how organizations should deal with that as we're moving through this?
I guess we'll say the same thing, Tanya. I'll let you go first, but I bet you're going to say what I say.
Well, I'm curious. I imagine we have both similar and probably some unique ideas as well, but certainly building trust, or I love how you're saying it, Terry, building or trust is something kind of foundational, but at the same time you can build trust. And it is something that we actually work with our clients quite a bit on. So creating values and how to enhance those values or how to strengthen those values in the workplace. But one of the most fundamental is going to be communications, because communications, again, and the two-way street of trust. So being open, being vulnerable, and showing that you're listening to your employees, understanding their perspectives, and modeling some of the behavior as well that you're looking for. So it really integrity comes into play with the building of trust. But you're absolutely right. A lot of the issues that employees are facing right now has to do with whether the extent to which they're trusting their managers or their workplace generally. And a lot of those will be, are they taking my needs to heart? Are they looking at it from my perspective? And so how you can demonstrate that will come to how you can communicate with them, how you can listen to them, and then how you can put in policies that kind of put those needs into perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just going to add to that Tanya brought this up a few times in her presentation, but one of the biggest issues that we've seen is communication. And I think that it is absolutely vital right now that constant, well thought through communication to employees is one way to really build trust. If they understand what's going on and the reasons for the things that are going on, because it's clear and there's concise communication, that can really eliminate some of those feelings of mistrust. And as we said earlier, even the best plans we've seen kind of go a little bit skewed because of that lack of communication, which has caused issues for employees and unnecessary, I think, turbulence that could have been avoided with a more well thought through communications plan. So that's another kind of element that I would add to that.
Okay, and then the final question I'll ask you, we're hearing a lot of I guess you could say, information, whatever you want to call it, about essentially about the mental health of workers as they're coming back to the workplace, right? The high levels of anxiety and so forth. And what would you suggest that our organizations put in place to address these mental health issues that could be returning into the workplace after this long period that we've been away?
Another excellent question. And we touched on this a bit last week as well. But mental health is going to be a big question. And, part of that so there's certainly some really good strategies you can put in place, and I'll mention them, but it also does come back a little bit to the question you asked before about trust, because some of these mental health challenges that people are having are really related to the world around them and what's going on, and it's a very challenging time. If you can put in place some strategies, such as communication strategies, such as how you communicate the plan that you put in place, you help that those stresses, and so that can help minimize. So that is a really important strategy, is how you communicate, how you share, you know, the thinking around how you've been supporting your employees. But beyond that, for mental health challenges, you can most certainly, for those employers who have an employee assistance program, to publicize it, to share it. There's a lot of resources out there. Even if you don't have a employee assistance program in place, it would be a really good time to consider putting them in. They really are a best practice to have, and they're not very expensive, so to add them would be, especially at this time, would be really useful. But there's other strategies you can put in. You can ensure to recommend to people that they take care of themselves. You can adapt those policies. We talked about that last week. Adapting policies to be more flexible can really help and support mental health. You can look at those leave policies like we were talking about earlier, and see if there's adaptations required to provide a little more space for your employees if they do need to. But most importantly, listening and communicating, again, can't be reinforced enough.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tanya, Lindsay, and Lila. We just appreciate your the information you shared with us for the last 2 weeks, and it's this is very, very critical information at this time. So, thank you on behalf of all of us in AFOE Canada. So, just to let you know that the recordings and the slides for all of our webinars will be added to our webinar page at on our website, www.afoa.ca. You know, if I could ask you to fill out the survey, which will appear after the webinar, and next week, now we'll be transitioning into another topic, which is investing during turbulent times, which is going to be presented by TP and IMI Insurance Partners. You know, the world kind of came to a standstill during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, pension plans drastically changed during that time. There may be questions and concerns that you may have. Is my retirement still on track? Should I change my investments? Do I feel like I'm the same investor as I was last year? And if you'd like to know more about the investment industry and how they've responded and what you can do to keep your retirement plans on track, this webinar is certainly something that will help you, guide you in your decision making. So I just like to promote, you know, we do have a certification that we're launched this year and we're piloting, and it's the Certified Indigenous Human Resource Professional. The first session begins on July 17th to the 19th, 2020. We'll be having that in a virtual environment like this. Certainly, we encourage you to sign up and certainly work toward that certification as well. So I want to thank each and every one of you for coming on to our session. What we're trying to do as well is for those people who have attended many of our sessions, we're going to give away prizes, you know, for 5 or 10, whatever it is, sessions that you participated in. Obviously, we have your emails and so forth, and we'll be sending you some of our AFOA swag and that kind of thing. So, you know, certainly let's look forward to that as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to come out and you know, and learn a little bit about some of the key items that are happening in our environment today. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Thanks.